Hello and welcome to the Business of Winning podcast, brought to you by Performance Insights, providing expert speakers and hosts from the world of Formula One motor racing to corporate events and conferences worldwide. Just click on www.performanceinsights.co.uk and send us your requirements.
Great to have you join us again on the Business of Winning podcast. And this time, slightly a change of gear for us because I met earlier this year Professor Raymond Boyle. He is Director of the Centre for Cultural Policy Research at Glasgow University. He is a really interesting person to talk to. This is someone who has been steeped in the world of media, of course, from an academic point of view, but really with some just fascinating insights on this fast-changing landscape. And he has really brought his expertise to bear by working with a colleague, Professor Richard Haynes from the University of Stirling, to produce a book which was published earlier this year. It's called Streaming the Formula One Rivalry, Sport and the Media in the Platform Age. And I can urge all of you listeners, anyone interested in the business of Formula One, to go out and buy a copy. Of course, it's available on all the usual channels you can buy books from, but particularly it's available on Amazon. Name of the book again, Streaming the Formula One Rivalry, Sport and the Media in the Platform Age, by Raymond Boyle and Richard Haynes. And I really enjoyed this conversation with Raymond. I attended his book launch earlier this year. And the thing that is so fascinating about this book is his analysis of the changing media landscape in Formula One, the way that the mainstream media has evolved and developed, the way in which content creators and influencers and social media has come to play such an important role in Formula One. And it will not surprise you to know that the Netflix effect, the impact of the Netflix Drive to Survive series on Formula One, is definitely part of the discussion that we're going to have on this episode, and also that is well covered within the book. It's really quite thought-provoking because it shows you just how much change has taken place within a very short time as regards to Formula One media landscape, and the way that, quite frankly, all of us fans today have an embarrassment of riches in terms of the choices that are available to us about how we follow and consume and enjoy the sport of Formula One, and the great work that indeed has been done since Liberty Media took over the sport from Bernie Ecclestone at the beginning of 2017. So much of what we're about to talk about is very recent in terms of its impact within the sport. I hope you really enjoy the conversation as much as I did with Raymond. And again, I urge you to go out and buy a copy. It's well worth adding it to your bookshelf. So I'm really delighted to be joined today by Professor Raymond Boyle from the University of Glasgow. And Raymond, just talk to me first of all about the backstory to this fantastic book that you have written along with your colleague, Professor Richard Haynes, Streaming the Formula One Rivalry, Sport and the Media in the Platform Age. What's the backstory to the creation of this book?
Well, I've been researching the relationship between the media and sport for more years than I care to remember. And I was struck back in 2017 when Liberty Media took over control of the commercial rights to Formula One. Struck by that, to my knowledge, it was the first time that a media company was taking over, not just a club or a team, as you often see in franchises, but actually, to all intents and purposes, an entire sport. So that I was fascinated to see how that might play out. And so in the back of my mind, that was something I was always kind of interested in kind of looking at. And in the meantime, I just finished a big project about talent and the talent industry, which was looking at television and how it recruited, developed and nurtured talent. So the two things kind of came together, bubbling along for a while. And then I felt post-COVID that enough time had elapsed to kind of actually look at that. And what I was interested in doing was really looking at the bigger picture about how sport and its relationship with the media is changing in what we call the platform age, and we may talk a bit more about that. And I thought that the case of F1 made a fascinating kind of case study, because it seemed to me to be a microcosm of a whole range of issues and trends. So a combination of those. Luckily, I've worked extensively with Richard in the past, and we share similar interests. So that kind of acted as the kind of catalyst then for thinking about the book, which took about probably about 16 months or so to from start to finish.
And for listeners who are maybe unfamiliar with the book, and I can really recommend it, we'll be giving details of where you can get that a little bit later on in the podcast. It's a very easy to follow format of the book. There are essentially 6 chapters. It starts with setting up the scene of sport media and the platform economy, moves on to the racing history of Formula One and the media, and then, of course, the all-important digital F1 world and reinventing the sport. And then the second half of the book is around the storytelling, the journalism and media representation in Formula One, the streaming world, media rights, and the Netflix effect. We'll talk about all of these in due course. And then finally, I must say, a chapter I found really fascinating: new patterns of fandom and the future of Formula One. So that gives you a snapshot, listeners, of what's in this book. So let me just come back to you, Raymond, with a comment really from my side as a reader. You know, I'm 62 years old, so I belong to an older generation of person in terms of who's worked in Formula One and followed the sport. There's a tendency amongst my age group to talk about the good old days of Formula One when it was free to air on television. You know, the BBC era with Murray Walker and James Hunt broadcasting live, typically on BBC Two. But then you read your book, and I'm reminded just what a world of riches the fan has today. It really has never serviced the fan base better than it has in 2024.
No, absolutely, and you know, there is always that tendency to look back to a golden era that probably never really existed. And I mean, if you take the long view of the relationship between the media and Formula One, there's actually been very few periods where anything has been settled. There's always been conflict, there's always been turmoil, and of course, what's interesting, which we examined in the book, is the kind of disruptive nature of technology, either within the sport itself, but from my interest, from how the sport is disseminated. So how it's produced, how it's distributed, and how it's consumed, in the way that almost every 5-6 years there's a major disruption comes into play, which changes that relationship. I think the other thing to say is that what younger people or younger fans are often surprised by is actually how little live sport there was on television 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And you know, you can now watch more football matches in a weekend than were broadcast live in an entire season when I was growing up. So as you say, we've gone from a kind of a supply-led media system to a much more demand-led media system, and that's got obviously benefits, but of course it also has challenges.
Now, one thing that struck me as well when I read the book was when you dived into this topic and working with Richard to put this together, it must have struck you that there's a really interesting case study in Formula One, because we had this sea change in 2017 with Liberty Media taking over the sport. Bernie Ecclestone had built it into a huge beast of a Formula One World Championship, but in so many respects that marked kind of ground zero for Liberty being able to then plan the future. And it's only been 8 years, and here we are looking back on a period of incredible change and transformation brought about by the work that they've done.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things in terms of the book itself, the kind of methods, one of the methods we used, obviously, we looked at a lot of material, and Richard in particular, both of us have had a long historical interest in the sport, but we also did a lot of interviews. We spoke to a lot of kind of key stakeholders and people in the industry and out of the industry. And one of the things that was fascinating was speaking to people about how when Liberty Media rocked up, as it were, to find and ask where was the marketing department. when they'd taken over and found that, well, there wasn't really a marketing department, and indeed, they had to go about systematically building one, and indeed building a communications team. So the analogy of year zero is actually very apt, and of course that meant there were lots of kind of relative easy gains, but then, as you say, since then it's been kind of interesting to look at the kind of strategic development. And I think one overall strategic element that Liberty saw was to grow and open up the sport. And if you speak to some of the journalists, they say that interestingly, initially there was almost a closing down, because almost it was like, as you say, actually we're going to have to build something here before we can actually kind of release it into the community. And so the idea of kind of opening up the paddock and making it more accessible, bringing cameras in, to paraphrase one of the American sports producers who talks about sport and says, you need to be up close and personal. And, doing that, trying to create that environment. Whereas initially many of the journalists felt that actually the relationship they had was actually changed. And actually it took a while, I think, to kind of establish the kind of the new ground rules, if you like.
Yeah, it's a really interesting insight that you provide in the book. You interview people like Andrew Benson, who is the BBC's principal Formula One correspondent, and might be viewed as kind of legacy media in that regard. But and some really interesting comments in that particular section around the fact that the legacy media found it kind of closing down. Initially, there's a lot more control, isn't there, over access to drivers and team principals than might have been in the case in the past. But it's a combination of control, but it's also an insight into just how busy the teams and drivers have become in this new media age. They've got so many conflicting requirements, haven't they?
No, absolutely. And in one sense, I mean, Formula One was interesting because in some senses it came late to the digital party, if you like, in the sense that it was one of the last sports to really kind of go out and embrace that. And in terms of the kind of the closing down, it's still one of the few elite sports where, 5 minutes before they actually get in a car and, put their lives at risk, they can still have a microphone stuck in front of their face as the drivers, and they're still asked to comment. And I mean, I'm always struck by the kind of what seems to the outsider looking in as the relative mayhem in the paddock, relatively short before this event. And you can imagine, at the Etihad or at Old Trafford or whatever, I mean, that kind of access would simply not be available. So there's a kind of a paradox, if you like, in the sport. But I think also what you saw was a growing professionalisation. I was struck by a comment by Bradley Lord, who we spoke with, of course, Chief Communications Officer at Mercedes, and he noted that when he started just over 10 years ago, they had 4 people working in comms at Mercedes, and the last count, and I spoke to Bradley in 2022, at the last count they had 22 people working in comms, and part of that reflects the point you were making, Mark, that they now are actually a content provider and actually are pushing out content, interacting with content across a range of platforms. And of course, to some extent, they think, do we need the media, the legacy media, as you mentioned, in the same way? And when you speak to them, they all say they do need it, but actually they also recognise that there are other things that they're able to now provide and do, and hence, that's one of the growth areas. Actually, the comms side of Formula One is one of the growth areas, because that's the genie is out of the bottle in that side, and it's not going to go back in anytime soon.
So this is a topic I'm really interested in because so much of the media that is now consumed by fans is actually controlled. So, you mentioned Bradley Lord and his team of 22 people at Mercedes. So Mercedes are controlling a lot of the content that goes out. Red Bull have their own content pool, for goodness sake, online. So they have a whole media business based around all their activities, including Formula One. And then when you look at Formula One's coverage itself, you have Sky Sports F1. They pay a huge amount of money to Formula One. There's a business relationship there between Sky and F1. So that kind of raises the question, how independent are Sky in terms of editorial control and things like that. And of course, you then have F1 TV, so Formula One's own, direct to consumer OTT, over the top, as they call it, mechanism by which you as a consumer can access Formula One directly. But all of that bundled together, you then wonder, how independent is the media in this landscape where there's so much control and so many commercial relationships at stake?
I mean, it's a very live issue, and it's not unique to the elite sport of Formula One. Any of the top elite global sports have seen this professionalization, if you like, of media and media relations in the last decade or so, and it does raise challenges around the spaces for, I suppose, robust, uncomplicit journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, you can add another factor into that mix, and that is, to some extent, the crisis that's existed within legacy media, where actually, the idea of sending an independent F1 correspondent, for example, from a media outlet to 24 races, the cost of that alone is prohibitive. And so you have a kind of a perfect storm, to some extent, in the challenges that journalism has. The flip side of that, I suppose, is that you also have, through social media and through differing technologies such as the podcast that we're talking in today, you have other spaces where people can actually discuss, critique, comment on the industry, both from a kind of a fan's perspective, but also from a more nuanced business-related perspective. So the chatter, if you like, the sports chatter around the sport is probably greater than it's actually ever been. So I think we have to kind of see things in their totality, that there is clearly attempts to control narratives more, but equally you could make the counter argument, which I would certainly do, which actually media management or controlling the media now is actually almost more difficult than it once was, because there are so many kind of outlets, there are so many potential dissenting voices. Of course, and you mentioned Andrew Benson and others, there is still, in my opinion, a key role for that kind of rather more kind of authority-based voice. And I think that's one of the challenges more generally that is often the case, that coming to a new sport, for example, you need it curated for you. You need some sense of somebody helping you around the complex landscape. And so I think there are still spaces for these particularly kind of experienced, trusted journalists who have an inside track, but equally are not scared to ask those difficult questions. But that doesn't apply to all, unfortunately. So you kind of run the whole range, if you like.
So this becomes a really fascinating topic, because you've just mentioned that at one end you've got the teams and the control over content, and at the other end you've got huge amounts of chatter. You think about social media, there are proliferation of Formula One feeds, websites, YouTube channels, from individuals sitting in their bedroom just producing content on their cell phones or their mobile phones, etc. And then somewhere in the middle you have professional media who are earnestly trying to deliver a judicious, independent insight into what is actually happening. And again, for the third time, we're going to mention Andrew Benson. So I always say to people, well, if you read what's on the BBC, or you go to a publication like Motorsport Magazine, where Mark Hughes writes for them, you're talking to journalists who are on site. They are professional journalists. They've covered the industry for many decades. They have long-standing relationships with key people who they talk to directly on and off the record. So actually, in this world of prolific media, there is now perhaps an even narrower vein, a narrower seam of media where you can get an honest, independent, insightful view to what is happening in the sport.
No, I think that's the case, and I think it's interesting if you kind of imagine a kind of a triangle with journalism at one apex, entertainment at another apex, and drama at the third apex. Kind of sport sits right in the middle of that. It has attributes of entertainment, but it also has to kind of conform to aspects of journalistic practice, and also it's kind of drama. And I think the challenge is often over the years is for sports to be dragged in particular directions. And I think if you become too much solely focused on the kind of entertainment dimension of sport, any sport, then that is not always a healthy place to be. So we kind of need that balance of kind of the questioning reporting journalism that. And I think you mentioned a key point there, actually, which I know you've talked about or written about before, which is people who are on site, people who are actually there hanging out, as it were. Somebody once described that to me as journalism. It's about hanging around, and actually, it's a kind of a underestimated attribute that is required to kind of find out what's actually going on, as opposed to the danger of sitting at a desk and simply being inundated by different types of content, different types of kind of releases, and then regurgitating them to some extent, topping and tailing them and sending them back out again. So actually I think that's a real challenge. And I think it's become more acute for F1 as it's expanded its season. It's now become it always was global, but 24 races, the travel involved, it becomes very difficult to build up that kind of sustained relationship. And as you say, there is probably only really a kind of a handful of core journalists who kind of occupy that space. But it is, you'll know better than me, but I would imagine it is pretty attritional in terms of how you sustain that.
Yeah, it's definitely the case that there are fewer and fewer media who would even begin to attend all the races. Whereas when I started working in Formula One, we had 14 or 15 Grand Prix. They were principally based in Europe. It was a world championship, really, in name alone. We had we visited Japan once, we visited Australia, Canada. Most of the races were in Europe. Of course, these days, it's the opposite is the case. Most are outside Europe. And as you say, we now have 24 Grand Prix. One question I want to ask you is that all of this change and transformation in Formula One's media landscape has also occurred in the wake of a global pandemic, which promoted remote working. It meant that a lot of people weren't able to travel to cover Formula One in 2020 and 2021, and that must have had an impact in Formula One and in global media of all kinds, in terms of editors and, dare I say it, the finance department saying, you don't need to go to a race. You don't need to travel to an event to cover it anymore because you're well catered for with all the online content.
No, I think that's correct. And I think that's been a kind of, and we're only, we're bouncing back to some extent in certain areas of the workplace. You see certain kind of corporate firms and various others wanting to kind of change the kind of hybrid pattern. But I think particularly going back to my earlier point about the kind of wider crisis, often financial crisis in certain areas of the media, that actually kind of lent itself to, as you say, that kind of cutting back. And it also did something else. It also opened the pool to a wider group of potential influencers. And again, connecting it with kind of Liberty Media's strategy, which was interesting in the sense that obviously, ideally, they want people to either come to events or, given the global nature and the highly unlikely nature of somebody following them around for 24 races, they want people to subscribe, to engage with the televisual content. And it is still fundamentally television. It's maybe distributed and viewed in different ways. So they're kind of still, they're kind of wanting that. And one of the ways they saw about doing that was you have to create a new audience. Television sport is in difficulty in terms of its age demographic, particularly in the States, where the average age watching NFLs, I think, is right into the 50s, and they want to bring that down. And the way they were doing that was by allowing in more influencers, reaching younger people through social media, etc. So COVID, I think, heightened that. I think these trends, as with a lot of things with looking back on COVID, a lot of these things were probably underlying, and what COVID acted as was an accelerator to some of these trends. And to its credit, Formula One, of course, was one of the first really global sports to really, show its kind of logistical skills to some extent by getting back on the road, by actually getting back racing, which it was incredible in itself, and in so doing, built on the back of that and expanded through social media and influencers. So I think the traditional journalists kind of found themselves not only having that kind of spatial difficulty of not being there, they also now found themselves surrounded by lots of these other people who some called themselves journalists, but certainly they had influence in terms of kind of beginning to shape the narratives, and I think that often kind of was quite a tension to some extent as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I was going to name drop now. I was with David Coulthard last week, and we were talking about the changing media landscape, and he was commenting on the proliferation of content creators and social media influencers who are now working within Formula One. And we both agreed it's a great thing because, of course, when young people are being provided with content by their own peers, and in your book you talk about a number of individuals, Tony Cowan Brown, who I know. I've written about Tony's work as a content creator, and you have a piece there in the book around Lizzie McIntosh. I mean, it's very, very topical to talk about her in light of what you just said, because she only began, I think, posting on TikTok in 2021. That's only 3 years ago, and she now has 424,000 followers on TikTok. She's had I looked this morning, she's had 21 million people like and engage with content that she's posted online. So in this case, we're talking about young women who have arrived into the sport as a result of the growth in audiences and the accessibility that Liberty Media have made possible through the provision of content across a number of different platforms. So it's really broadened the audience and changed the demographic of Formula One's following quite profoundly.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that's interesting there also in terms of the media side of it. One is the way in which, and Liberty Media recognise this themselves, that they recognise that perhaps not everyone's going to sit down and take, 2 hours out of their weekend or whatever and sit and watch a race. But you know what? If they don't do that, that's fine, because they're actually engaging with what's going on other kind of platforms. And the second thing for somebody of my generation as well, pay television. When Formula One moved to pay television, we talked a lot about paywalls and talked about putting it behind a walled garden, blah, all these analogies. What social media did, of course, was actually, it was like burrow all these holes into those walls, because actually social media allowed people to access parts and pieces of the content. And the default position originally of a lot of the rights holders was to try to stop that, was to close it down. And interestingly, given the success, it was in the US that they were the first to do that. They were the first people to actually really open up their stadiums. I'm old enough to remember when a Premier League, an elite Premier League football club, tried to ban people taking iPads into the game because they didn't want them taking photographs, because they wanted those photographs to be their own curated ones. While at the same time in New York, they were installing high-tech Wi-Fi into all their stadiums to open up the event. They realised that this genie was out.
Yeah.
We had to engage with it. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting way in which the shift from hardcore pay television, which is now much more porous in terms of the streamers, in terms of the deals, the access to content. And the other point you made, which is really important, was not only is it a new audience demographically, it's a new audience in terms of age, it's a new audience in terms of its broader demographic. And that very much plugs into narratives around inclusion and diversity, and a kind of an understanding of where that generation is in terms of the values, etc., that they see are important. And the importance for sport to grow, for any sport to grow, to recognise that. And some sports have been much quicker at that than others, and some have been very resistant to that. But ultimately, those that want to grow are actually all recognising that actually we need to be aware of these differing values that our audiences have and make sure that our sport is reflecting those. So it becomes an interesting kind of two-way process, symbiotic process. It's not one leading the other. The two actually end up playing off each other.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point you make there about the way that social media and the way that the development of these new streaming platforms has enabled people to drill in, to burrow into different aspects of the sport, and also to consume it in new and interesting ways. I've noticed in the last year, whenever I'm away on holiday, if there's a Grand Prix on, I quite often will follow the race live on the Formula One app, and I'm just looking at the timing system. And then within a few hours of the race, I can watch a 15-minute highlight on YouTube, which is the key points, and I can do that without the family noticing that I've skipped away to watch the highlights of the race. And none of that was possible before. So it's really increased the amount of choice that's available to consumers. So let's take a step right back to the beginning and talk about TV, because you and I are based in the UK. We have Sky Sports F1 covering all the race live, and it's hours and hours. I forget. Martin Brundle told me recently of how many hours of live TV he has to get involved in a typical weekend. It's just insane. So you got Sky Sports F1. You've got that massive offering that they provide. You then have highlights available free to air on Channel 4, and those rights are provided to them by Sky. So Sky own the rights. They provide then the highlights to Channel 4. We don't have F1 TV Pro in the UK, but that is available to fans in, I think, 89 countries around the world. So you've now got so the model that we see in the UK is being replicated in some markets. It's different in other markets, but this means that Formula One has a number of tools in its toolbox in terms of what it can do to optimize audiences country by country as they seek to maximize the opportunity worldwide.
No, it isn't, and it's interesting. They haven't adopted a one size fits all model. It's actually quite a sophisticated model. I mean, going back to what we now call, I suppose, the Bernie era. It was a very basic and lucrative but rather unsophisticated kind of model, which was you sold the rights to a broadcaster. They broadcast it, and on the back of that, you were able to sell and promote sponsors. And to put it crudely, in some cases, television became a means to deliver an audience to advertisers or deliver an audience to sponsors. And it was a fundamentally a model that existed from the early 80s right the way through into the early 2000s. And so, but the more sophisticated model now around rights, I think, is fascinating, because there is always a lot of debate, and it goes on. I mean, it's going on in other organizations. It goes on in football with FIFA and other organizations. Should you actually just have one point of contact so that the rights are actually maintained by the rights holder, and they simply put them on a platform and just send it out there? Now, F1 doesn't do that, and it doesn't do that for quite intelligent and strategic reasons, some of which you've mentioned. One is it gives them leverage. To have their own platform means that if they can't get a rights deal in a geographical area that they think matches their own valuation, well, we have the leverage to just to move into that market with that. You also have a fact, which is that if you're in Asia, or you're in kind of North America, wherever it is, if you do have a rights holder, for example, like here in the UK, like Sky, they will promote the sport because they have a vested interest in promoting it, because they want to get additional subscribers. You would need a very sophisticated international localized marketing arrangement to be able to make sure that if you were in Malaysia, or you were in India, or you were in Australia, that actually you were customizing your content, you were customizing your promotion to best maximize that. So, for example, in terms of drivers, there are obviously particular interest in particular parts of the world. So this kind of notion that we're going to move to a one-size-fits-all, where a global rights holder will just simply say, right, we're just going to put it on our own platform, cut out all the middle people. Well, no, we're in a much more kind of hybrid, sophisticated dimension at the moment, where in some cases, the value offered by traditional and digital companies in the UK, such as Sky, is such that it makes good commercial sense to let Sky do that, to Sky promote the product, to promote the brand. In other places, as you say, where perhaps we don't have that, or we're building an audience. I mean, it was interesting. I remember being struck by speaking to a producer once, and they were talking about how that in a certain European market, I think it was actually Top Gear, was being pirated. And there was it was Poland, I think. No Polish broadcaster had the rights to Top Gear, but it was actually being pirated and shown online. And what the BBC did, which was actually quite clever, was to say, rather than to try to close it down, which has been the traditional model about piracy, they simply said, they used it as a kind of form of market research and said, look how popular this program is. And on the back of it, of course, they sold Top Gear to one of the Polish broadcasters. So it was a kind of form of, I mean, so I suppose my point is that, again, when you take the long view, this is an evolving game, and people who come on, and there are many conferences around the futures of streaming and sports and the future of streaming and television. People that say they know what's happening, you don't, but you're in the middle of a kind of an evolving process, and I think what's been striking about Liberty Media's strategy on this is that they have very cleverly positioned themselves to make sure that whatever kind of the broader direction of travel is, they are positioned to make sure they're in a position to exploit that, either through traditional selling to third parties or retaining the rights and using their own platform.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I could just give you a personal experience on where Formula One is at the moment. So I want to be a customer of Formula One, and in the UK that means buying a Sky Sports subscription, which I don't want to do because I spend most of the year abroad. So as a result, I buy the races on a race by race basis through Now TV, which means I pay £14.99 to watch a Grand Prix on Now TV live. When I'm abroad, the only way I can watch Formula One is if I use a VPN to access Now TV. When I'm in Australia, I buy it from a platform called KO, which is a local provider. But if you try to buy F1 TV Pro in those 89 countries outside the UK, it won't let you do that as a UK customer because at the moment it has your address in the UK. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is, to your point exactly, it's still evolving. And ultimately, Formula One has an even bigger opportunity to increasingly make the fans its direct customers, because it'll actually generate far more revenue. And by the way, as I've just said, I'm quite happy to part with my money to access fantastic content from Formula One wherever in the world I happen to be.
No, absolutely. And it's that sense to which this is a kind of an ongoing process. And I think what's challenging for many rights holders and challenging, I think, sometimes for governing bodies of sport is that pace of change has speeded up. If again, going back to taking the slightly longer view, there was relatively settled periods where the model was pretty clear. And we move from that to a pay television model, which becomes disruptive. And Formula One, of course, again, hedging its bets, goes into a kind of a BBC Sky deal in the early kind of 2012 or whatever, before migrating, in one sense, across to Sky. So this is a kind of a continuing shifting landscape, and part of that is driven by the changing consumption patterns, media consumption patterns, and I think it's kind of trying to stay ahead of that. I think is a good reason why having a company with kind of quite clear media orientation running it is going to give you a kind of first mover advantage in many ways, that they're already trying to look round the corner about what's coming next. And, as I said, if you go to some of these conferences, you would go away and think the world was going to change dramatically in the next couple of days. And actually what you begin to see when you take the long view, as I tend to do, is you see a lot of change, but you also see a lot of continuity. There's elements that there's still certain things have to be in the mix. And you mentioned compelling content, and you can have all the technology and all the platforms, and you can do all the clever things you like, but if you ain't got compelling content, then you're not going to have that audience.
I completely agree, and I wanted to just you've just alluded to the fact that Formula One has benefited enormously from ownership by a media company. we talk about the Bernie Ecclestone era, that the latter part of the Bernie Ecclestone era saw Formula One owned by a private equity company, CVC Capital. And arguably, and if any CVC people are listening, I apologize for what I'm about to say, but arguably because they didn't understand the media landscape, and because of private equity's business model, there just wasn't the investment in the growth of Formula One that Liberty has then made possible. Liberty see the increase in revenues being made possible by increasing access and growing audiences, and that's what they've achieved. So that's a whole topic you and I think could probably spend a whole other podcast talking about. But before we finish this one, and I have intentionally left this bit to last, let's talk about Netflix. There's almost an entire chapter of your book devoted to what we call the Netflix effect. And you and I are recording this podcast in the wake of another successful United States Grand Prix in Austin, Texas. There are now, of course, 3 Formula One races in the United States. And Netflix has done something incredible for Formula One. I personally view it as a 10-part television commercial for Formula One. It's incredible the way that has worked. But that has been a game changer, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's unquestionably being a kind of a major intervention and a kind of a jump start, particularly, but not exclusively, in the North American market. And of course, in many ways, it goes back to the point you were making earlier around, for example, COVID. And there's a way in which, I think it's 2019 is the first Netflix series, and there's a way in which that a number of factors come together, which kind of almost, to pardon my analogy, turbocharge the sport in a way which, of course, Bernie Ecclestone had been trying for up to 40 years to kind of break into the American market. And so there's a combination of factors of which, but Netflix is crucial. The fact that it really takes off during COVID, when people are, wanting to kind of binge watch and are, to all intents and purposes, you have a captive audience, is really important as well. And it's a really interesting kind of program, because you'll have hardcore F1 fans who might like it, but also kind of despise it slightly because they think it simplifies, it perhaps reconstructs or constructs, it panders to certain narratives, etc. But in fact, that's been the strength of Liberty Media. They've recognised, as other sports do, that you can have up to kind of 9 different segmentations of fans. So you've got the fans who will travel to whatever, right the way down to, as one person in the book described it, to make Kathy in Kansas, who's seen as the kind of the Netflix, watcher of Drive to Survive, who has no interest whatever, but gets pulled into the narratives around the drivers. And I think if you look at across all the series, they're quite interesting, because I think the initial one in particular, there was almost slightly more insight into the kind of backstory around the kind of business of the sport, and there had been previous documentaries that had tried to tell the backstories to McLaren and others. But of course, I think what they quickly realised is that if you put the drivers, and some of the team principals front and centre, and you build the narratives around that, that's what pulls people in. And in that sense, it has all the attributes of a kind of a soap opera. You have a kind of an open-ended narrative, because there's always the next race. There's always and of course you have all the kind of classic tropes of storytelling, which is about redemption and about heroes and villains. So it's all there, all bundled into a nice, highly professional, packaged and repackaged. And for those, I think we say in the book about the documentary side, because some people have taken issue with the veracity of it in terms of it being a documentary, and I just gently remind readers of the most famous documentary maker of all, Robert Flaherty, who made Nanook of the North way back in the 1920s, seen as one of the kind of forefounders of documentary. And he wanted to kind of capture the kind of histories of these people that lived in the frozen tundra. And when he went there, he found that they actually had forgotten how to do some of the kind of key the key tasks that he wanted to do, and he had to teach them again. So one of the things he had to do was to teach them to fish in a particular way. And of course, the point I was simply making was documentary filmmaking has always been a process of selection, construction, and organisation. The issue is there intrinsically a truth that has been told here? And we could debate that. That's a fascinating, almost moral debate about where that line gets drawn, or where is that conversation between Toto Wolff and somebody, has that been reconstructed for the cameras? Did the camera just happen to be there? And all these kind of issues feed into the kind of Netflix, but unquestionably a massive kind of booster for the sport. But I do think part of an underlying trend. So I think sometimes we can't see Netflix in isolation. It was part of a kind of a moving trend, and what it did, I think, was really kind of turbocharge the sport in terms of its profile among those non-F1 fans.
A question that I often get from people is, what next? And has Netflix done all they can do? And there's a quote actually from me in your book, which I read this morning, and I got it completely wrong, because 2 or 3 years ago, I thought Netflix couldn't do any more. But actually, to your point exactly, Formula One is a constantly reinventing soap opera. The storylines change over time. Drivers change teams. Daniel Ricciardo's just left the sport. Lewis Hamilton's about to go to Ferrari. Max Verstappen might end up at Mercedes-Benz in 2026. Actually, if you're Netflix, you can see a whole new script unfolding before your eyes year to year. So I'm actually wondering if there's ever an end to it, because in fact, they are just storytelling and providing insights to this compelling sport. Let me just move on to another point. You spoke to Ellie Norman from Formula One, and she made a very important point, which is that everyone talks about Netflix as being the sole reason for success in North America. But actually, Liberty Media have done a lot of work with ESPN as well. And there's a really interesting interplay there, isn't there, between Netflix, which doesn't show the Formula One races, but ESPN does show the Formula One races. So it's like Netflix is the net that catches this huge audience and draws them in to then want to watch the Formula One racing on a channel like ESPN.
No, absolutely, and I think it's taking that kind of holistic approach has been one of the kind of strategic approach has been one of the kind of strengths. But I think you're right about the kind of open-ended, the kind of soap opera dimension. I'm just struck at the weekend by, the younger drivers on the grid, the Liam Lawsons and whatever. And, for some of us who kind of read in around the sport, you much more than I would, but you'll know about these people. But I'm just thinking they're the kind of drivers that are going to, in terms of their profile, that are going to be beneficiaries of the next Netflix series, because they will actually bring those young drivers, many of them, some of them 18, 18, 19-year-olds, they're going to bring them to they're going to bring them to a new audience, and they're going to fill out, if you like, that backstory, which we've talked about this before, historically was done by the press, who told the stories, because actually in an F1 car you can hardly see who's driving, you can just see the helmet, and actually you can see how that introduction of kind of almost new drivers, new characters into the broader F1 narrative and story, that Netflix is going to be an important element in actually really filling out some of their characters, and to be crude, as somebody once said to me, actually giving them characters in some cases, some of the individuals involved. And so that's going to be fascinating to watch. So I think that kind of reinvention, which actually sport needs, particularly in an age where we all seem to have attention deficits in terms of the amount of time we want to spend on particular areas. So if we're becoming complacent or bored by something, there's always something else to move on to. So again, that's one of the challenges that F1 has, but all sports do have, and as they're trying to kind of maintain people's attention.
Now, Raymond, you and Richard worked on this book through 2022 and 2023, which was a period of domination of Formula One by Max Verstappen. And of course, that had followed a very long period of domination by Lewis Hamilton and the Mercedes-Benz team. But I'm going to quote you here directly. It says, sport is unscripted drama and thrives on competition and elements of jeopardy. We are in a season where 7 drivers have won Grand Prix. It is a golden moment, isn't it? The audience has grown. It's never been larger. Liberty have done so much work. And after this period of rather monotonous domination, we're now in a kind of golden era of multiple winners and jeopardy. It's an extraordinary success story, I would have thought, from Liberty's point of view.
No, absolutely. And I think, I'm sure they would say that actually, well, part of that, some of that comes from some of the things that we've implemented over the, in terms of the industry itself, in terms of cost caps, et cetera, as well. Often you pull these levers to make change and nothing seems to happen for a while. And then all of a sudden it seems to kind of happen quite quickly. And I think, that's certainly a crucial element to maintaining and developing the interest, and all the metrics will show that. With multiple F1 winners, with a much tighter World Championship, Constructors Championship, the metrics will all show audiences go up, interest increases, and I mean you saw that even during the Hamilton years, even under Bernie Ecclestone, you saw that the audiences actually gradually began to decline. As it became slightly more and more predictable, even in the kind of heartland, even in the kind of like UK heartland, where UK audiences love nothing more than seeing UK drivers or UK sports people succeeding. So in that sense, it's been really important that we've had this increasing element of competition. And I'm sure Liberty Media would say some of that's down to them, but it's also down to the kind of inherent nature of sport itself, which is one of the reasons why so many of us love it, is because, just when you think you've seen everything, just when you think, well, we know what's going to happen, something different comes along to change or challenge that. So again, that element of change, but also that continuity, which I think is really what I think as a broader kind of cultural form gives sports so much of its kind of compelling appeal.
Yeah, well, I think I'm sure all the listeners will join us in hoping that we're in for many more days of jeopardy in Formula One and lots of new winners and challengers to Max Verstappen's hegemony over the sport that we've seen in recent years. Raymond, it's been a delight to have you on the show. Thank you very much for your time. And listeners, you can buy this wonderful book, Streaming the Formula One Rivalry, Sport and Media, and the Media in the Platform Age. You can get that on Amazon and all good online bookstores. And once again, the authors are Professors Raymond Boyle and Richard Haynes. Thanks so much, Raymond, for being with us today.
Pleasure, Mark. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe to the Business of Winning podcast. And if you want to learn more about Performance Insights, simply visit our website at performanceinsights.co.uk, providing expert speakers and hosts from the world of Formula One motor racing to corporate events and conferences worldwide.